Hey, how's it going, guys? I have a pretty special announcement. Tomorrow, or technically today, is the 4th of July, and I have made a special sale on the liberal tier mugs. Through the 4th of July, there will be a 40% discount code on liberal tier mugs, so be sure to go ahead and check them out. If you're ever going to get one, now's the chance. First link in the description. Thank you guys for watching the video. Let's get right to it.
Hello. I had two questions. One of them was regarding your characterization of the left as fascist. You mentioned that there's essentially unbroken lineage between modern leftists and their grandparents back in the 1968 revolution.
Yes.
But I'd like, looking at where they came from, they were screaming Marx, Mao, and Marcuse in the streets
Right.
of 1968.
Right.
Marcuse was one of the cultural Marxists at Frankfurt School.
Right.
They were coming up with deconstructionist theories, how to tear apart the West.
Right. No, I'm more of the Frankfurt School, yeah.
And then back to Gramsci, basically back to Bolshevik revolution.
That's right.
Why not? I mean, it sort of muddles the issue, calling them fascists, and then saying that Nazis are, gay liberals in VSDM costumes.
Well, I mean, I've never said that particularly, so that's weird. Okay. So number one, the Nazis were up the left. The Nazis were up the left, and I mean, if you read Hitler's books, if you read Mein Kampf, what you find is that he was very heavily influenced by Marx. Right? The split between the National Socialists and the Communists was a split over power, not over fundamental principle. And the fact is that the Communists were fascists. I mean, Stalin was a fascist. I mean, fascist was a system of government that suggested that a top-down elite ought to rule every aspect of life. And the economic system that has been traditionally attached to that is one that involves seizure of private property and redistribution of it, which is something that both Hitler and Stalin did. So there is a high correlation between the left of today and the fascist left of today and the fascist left of yesteryear. I don't draw a massive distinction, really ideologically, between Nazism and communism because they both have the same source. It's just that the Nazis tended toward nationalism and the communists tended toward internationalism. This was their main conflict.
And then one other question. Essentially, the point of this lecture was diversity and its aspects, but you regarded it mostly as neutral for most of the lecture. You're more concerned with its character, which I think is good. But I would submit Putnam and Robert Putnam and Arthur Schlesinger in Disuniting America.
Yep.
The hostility of one tribe for another is among the most instinctive human reactions. Mass migrations have produced mass antagonism since the beginning of time.
Right.
Schlesinger, looking at the list of the most trusting places, Putnam.
No, I mean, I know the Putnam argument. So I know and the Putnam argument, essentially, and he's made this argument now. Putnam's a leftist, by the way, Robert Putnam. And he's very upset with the idea. He wanted to go with the diversity as our strength argument, but it turned out that in many cases diversity was not our strength when there was diversity of values. There are three types of diversity. I really only talked about two. I talked about diversity of thought, right, and I talked about diversity of race, right, diversity of ethnicity. There's a third type of diversity that's slightly deeper, and that's diversity of values. Within diversity of thought, there can be disagreements, right? But at the very end, as I suggested, there are certain values we all have to hold in common, right? And those values that we have to hold in common are deep and abiding and cross-racial or can be cross-racial. So what Putnam found in that same book that you're talking about, and when he studied this issue, what he says is racial diversity without any other driving factor, all it does is create more protest marches and interracial conflict. The exception to this is when people have a common goal in a community, which is why we have to have social fabric. It's why we all have to agree on basic values like freedom of speech, like basic decency, like don't knock some girl up and run away, like make sure that you pay for things, like taking care of my wife is my business and taking care of your wife is essentially your business. Right? We have to agree on values. If you do that, then racial diversity is a neutral. It doesn't make a difference at all. Because racial diversity has nothing. Once you don't have diversity of deep values, and we all have the same values, who cares what color your skin is? The problem with diversity is when there is a diversity of value systems entirely. And even the left agrees with this, by the way. The left, for example, wouldn't suggest that a community is made richer by a group of people who come in and then suggest, for example, that they get to just kill everyone. Right? This is not a community that's been made richer by a diversity of values. So the solution is so racial diversity correlates with conflict when there is no commonality of values. The solution that I have suggested, and the traditionally American solution, is that we need commonality of values and unity of values, and then racial diversity becomes a neutral. is you have a right to be angry because you're getting screwed by the Mexicans or the Chinese, or you're being screwed by the corporations. That's cheap. It's not worthy of the United States. There's anger that's justified and there's anger that's not justified. The difference between, I think, President Reagan and President Trump is that President Trump seems to double down on his base an awful lot and go back to his base and rely on his base, which is fine, but he's not somebody who's teaching people to think in a different way. Reagan was attempting to drag the country along with him. Reagan was attempting to convince people he was trying to convince people to think in new and different ways. And the great thought leaders in the conservative movement have always tried to do that. That was what William F. Buckley tried to do. It's what Milton Friedman tried to do. The people that we all read, the people who we all enjoy, the people we all love, the people we learn from are the people who are more interested in teaching than preaching. You can make a lot of money preaching, you can, but you can do a lot more good if you're able to use whatever platform you have in order to teach. And that means educating yourself, and it means engaging in conversations that are uncomfortable. And it means knowing how to engage in those conversations in a productive fashion. I really think that the future for conservatism is bright. I think that the future for conservatism is a conservative libertarian merger, actually. The notion that conservatives have to understand that government sucks at everything, just as libertarians believe. And libertarians have to acknowledge that the Judeo-Christian value system of the country is fundamental to the success of a liberty enterprise. And I'm not even talking about in terms of legislation. I'm talking just in terms of a social fabric that works. If we can acknowledge these two things, then the future for the conservative movement is bright, because the truth is, right now is a great time for recruiting people on the left. Yes, they despise President Trump. They despise President Trump. So that means that the situation is polarized. But there's a really good argument I found with folks on the left who despise President Trump. Okay, you hate President Trump. I hated President Obama. I thought he was a crappy president. I have a solution that will fix everything for both of us. Take power away from the federal government, and then you don't have to care. The argument for liberty, not to quote Breitbart all the time, but what Andrew used to say is that if you can't make the argument for freedom and liberty, then you suck at making arguments. And I think that that's true. And I think that everyone in this room is capable of making those arguments. These are all arguments that are easily made with a little bit of background knowledge. Quick note, if you ever want to be an expert on anything, read one book. Really, if you read one book on any given topic, this makes you more informed than 99.7% of the American population on any given topic. Really, not because people are stupid, but because people don't actually read. So you are all capable of reading one book on any given topic and being the quote-unquote expert in the room, for the most part, on any given topic. And that means that it is incumbent on you to go out there and lead. There is no glass ceiling. There is just the sky above all of us, and it's incumbent on us to make sure that we reach the aspirations for the country. We're now in, I think, a tipping point period, and it's not just going to be up to President Trump and Congress. I mean, Congress is always going to suck at everything. I mean, they do, and President Trump will be what he is. But the bottom line is that the future of the country doesn't rest in Washington, D.C. The future of the country rests on you going and talking to your friends, going and talking to your peers, going on Facebook, talking with people, tweeting at people, coordinating with people, organizing. It takes a generation to build a movement. But Charlie's really started building a movement here, and you're all part of that movement, and you're the leaders who I'm going to be voting for one day. Thanks so much. Happy to take all questions. I mean, I think that the real turning point of the century was the fall of the Soviet Union. So the fall of the Soviet Union thrust the left and the right into more direct conflict than before. So before, the left used to win arguments essentially by saying that the right was the worst thing that could happen to the country, and the right used to win arguments by saying, no, the Soviet Union is the worst thing that can happen to the country. And most Americans tended to believe the Soviet Union was worse than the right, and so in presidential elections, Republicans would win a lot. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it was hard for Republicans to adjust, and so Republicans tended to instead focus on terrorism, which is fine. I mean, it is the great threat to the country. But the truth is that the great threat to the country is the ideology of the left that's hollowing us out from the inside. And if conservatives don't catch on to that and re-educate people on basic principles, then they're going to lose. So they don't get to rely on the specter of the Soviet Union to allow them victory anymore. They now have to make affirmative arguments in favor of conservatism that they've never felt they had to make in the past. So that was the turning point, but there can be another turning point if we understand what the task is before us. I'll repeat the questions for those who can't hear. Okay, so the question is, how do you explain aligning Judaism with conservatism? And the answer is that Judaism is conservative. Judaism is, as a religion, extraordinarily conservative. It's socially conservative. It is fiscally conservative. The biblical tax rate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 22.5%. If you look at all the various taxes, the tithing and all that, it's like 22.5% flat tax, essentially. There is no notion in the Old Testament of a really hardcore centralized government. Even the king didn't have a ton of power except over the military. The idea that Judaism is some sort of social justice-oriented leftist movement is just nonsense, which is why Orthodox Jews vote about 70-30 Republican, and everyone else in the Jewish community votes the opposite, votes 90-10 Democrat. Because the truth is that the Jewish community, for the most part, is deeply irreligious. The Jewish community is not religious. And so if you just looked at it that way, you would see that the reality is that non-religious people, atheists and agnostics, vote Democrat. Religious people vote Republican. So my answer to why aren't more Jews conservative is most Jews are not really Jewish. Most of them are ethnically Jewish, but most of them are not actually Jewish. It's like asking if a bunch of lapsed Catholics are conservative or not.
Hi, Ben. I'm a huge fan. So I've seen a lot of graphics that say Ben Shapiro for president 2020. Would you ever consider running for president or any other public office, and why or why not?
Well, I mean, I believe that there's been a constitutional amendment put in place that means you either have to be a reality TV star or a relative of a former president in order to run. So I'm not sure if I qualify. I wouldn't rule anything out. I wouldn't rule anything out.
Hi, I'm fangirling right now, but I can't conceal it right now. How would you address a person who wants to argue about morality with a humanistic base instead of a theistic one? I've been reading a lot of Francis Schaeffer. I don't know if you're familiar
Okay, yes.
with him. Yeah.
Okay, so arguing on a humanistic basis as opposed to a religious one ignores the fact that humanism is a direct outgrowth of the Judeo-Christian value system. This is the big problem with secular humanism. Secular humanism is fine so far as it goes, but from an atheistic viewpoint, and most atheist philosophers are honest enough to acknowledge this. Richard Dawkins acknowledges this. Sam Harris acknowledges this. Harari acknowledges this. Most people who are honest atheistic philosophers realize that science does not dictate morality. Right? There's a very good case to be made for tyranny, slavery, and genocide just according to the rules of nature. So this idea that we can inherently discover in nature that people are equal and deserve not to be enslaved, if that were true, then most of human history would not be dominated by all of these tremendous evils. So it was a Judeo-Christian value system that created secular humanism. Secular humanism is fine, as I say, so far as it goes, but if it fails to recognize where it came from, and it really came from one verse in Genesis that says that all human beings are made in God's image, which is what makes us special and worthwhile, then they are failing to acknowledge the fundamental root of Western civilization.
Hi, Ben. Sorry.
I think there's a microphone going around, so it'll come around to you.
My name's Francesca Bailey, and my question is, do you think the shooting at the congressional baseball game was a result of hate speech rhetoric toward Donald Trump and the GOP?
Okay, so a couple of things on this. I don't believe in the concept of hate speech as a general rule. And I think that we on the right should be very careful about mimicking the snowflakery that we see from the other side. So I've been on enough college campuses where people say things like, if I go on a college campus and I say a man is a man and a woman is a woman and they can't magically change, then this is considered hate speech by a lot of people on the left, and I'll be protested, and they'll try to ban me from campus. If I say that Black Lives Matter is a movement that has gotten a lot of black folks killed by preventing proper policing that is necessary for law-abiding black people, then I'll be banned because it's quote-unquote hate speech. I think we need to be very careful with this. So I discussed this actually at length on my podcast today. I think that there are basically three types of speech, two of them that are in question. Two of them are dangerous, one of them is not. Okay, the two types that are dangerous are the open advocacy of violence, right? The Antifa kind of stuff. Go out there, kill people, hurt people, punch a Nazi, right? That kind of stuff is definitely dangerous. I'm always loath to attribute any one crazy person's, to attribute an entire climate to the activity of one person, something the left really likes to do. Oklahoma City bombing, it's Rush Limbaugh's fault. JFK's assassinated, it's the climate of hate in the country. I hate that kind of stuff. But if you are advocating violent rhetoric, then that is not worthwhile. Second is defending violence. right? If you are somebody who says, well, I sort of understand where the guy's coming from, and you do see this sort of rhetoric on a fairly regular basis. I think Kathy Griffin sort of falls into this area, the holding up of Trump's head and all of that, that kind of speech. Where I get dicey on this is when people start saying things like, well, the left, well, they call themselves the resistance. Isn't that terrible? Guys, like 6 months ago, we were calling ourselves the Tea Party, which is an active anti-government resistance group historically. So, like, no. When the left says that Trump is a fascist or he's a tyrant or any of this kind of stuff, I don't care. I don't think that that drives violence, and I think that we have to be very careful that we don't end up in a situation where we're attempting to ban speech ourselves because we think that it's quote-unquote dangerous. So that's sort of the breakdown in terms of speech.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for tweeting me the other day. I literally cried. And true story. And secondly, do you believe that we have a wage gap, like a current wage gap?
Between men and women?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is no wage gap between men and women for women who are straight out of college and are single and do not have kids. The wage gap not only does not exist, there is, if anything, a reverse wage gap. So according to a study quoted in Time magazine in 2010, women are earning 8% more than men in 50 major cities across the United States, on average coming straight out of college. The truth is that women take more time off from work. They take different jobs than men. A lot of high-paying jobs for men involve men going into really dangerous places and doing really dangerous things that women either don't want to do or aren't physically qualified to do. I mean, I'm sorry to break it to the left, but it turns out that on average, women are not as strong as men. So, there are going to be more male firemen than fire women, just as a general rule. When it comes to the reality is that the wage gap it entirely disappears once you factor out the types of jobs that are being done, the amount of time in the workforce, the amount of time taken off, the number of hours worked. My wife, again, not to use her as an example for everything, my wife's a perfect example of this. She took off a year between her residency, between med school and residency. Between second and third year of medical school, she took off a year to take care of our first baby, and then she took off a few months after she had our second baby, before she went back to residency. I took off a week both times. And that's not because I'm so strong and tough or because she's so weak and fragile. She's really tough. It's because my wife wanted to spend time with our kids, and that was her choice, and thank God we were able to make that happen. So that's not, that is not a rip on women at all. In fact, I think it's glorious that so many women want to take time out to do the most important thing that any human being can do, which is raise their children.
Good evening, my name is Marietta. What are the 3 most influential books?
Okay, so I think that I think that 2 of the 3 are really easy. So the Federalist Papers, you should actually read. It's not just a bad book assignment, it's actually imperative to understand how the Constitution works. There's a book called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, which is like 150 pages long. You can read it in a couple of sittings. It's really great stuff. And I would say, I usually recommend as my third, The Quest for Cosmic Justice by Thomas Sowell, which is a relatively easy read, and also the basic premise of it is all about why the left has this transformational view of politics, why they think that government can be used to solve any problem under the sun. And those 3 books, you read those, and that gives you a pretty solid grounding in conservative thought. Dude, I can't recommend my own book.
Hello everyone! Hey, I'm just stopping by to remind you that liberals are insane! Social justice warriors are becoming more violent and triggered than ever before. Anyways, be sure to subscribe to KGP TV on YouTube and have a blessed day. Yeah, man!
There's essentially unbroken lineage between modern leftists and their grandparents back in the 1968 revolution.
Yes.
But I'd like, looking at where they came from, they were screaming Marx, Mao, and Marcuse in the streets
Right.
in 1968.
Right.
Marcuse was one of the cultural Marxists in Frankfurt School.
Right.
They were coming up with deconstructionist theories, how to tear apart the West.
Right, no, I'm more of the Frankfurt School, yeah.
And then back to Gramsci, basically back to the Bolshevik revolution.
That's right.
Why not? I mean, it sort of muddles the issue, calling them fascists and then saying that Nazis are, gay liberals and BS.
Hey, how's it going, guys? I have a pretty special announcement tomorrow, or technically today, is the 4th of July, and I have made a special sale on the liberal tier mugs. Through the 4th of July, there will be a 40% discount code on liberal tier mugs, so be sure to go ahead and check them out. If you're ever going to get one, now's the chance. First link in the description. Thank you guys for watching the video. Let's get right to it.
Hello. I had two questions. One of them was regarding your characterization of the left as fascist. You mentioned...
And the economic system that has been traditionally attached to that is one that involves seizure of private property and redistribution of it, which is something that both Hitler and Stalin did. So there is a high correlation between the left of today and the fascist left of today and the fascist left of yesteryear. I don't draw a massive distinction, really ideologically, between Nazism and communism, because they both have the same source. It's just that the Nazis tended toward nationalism and the communists tended toward internationalism. This was their main conflict.
And then one other question. Essentially, the point of this lecture was diversity and its aspects, but you regarded it mostly as neutral for most of the lecture. You're more concerned with character, which I think is good. But I would submit Putnam and Robert Putnam and Arthur Schlesinger in Disuniting of America.
Yep.
The hostility of one tribe for another is among the most instinctive human reactions. Mass migrations have produced mass antagonism since the beginning of time.
Right.
Schlesinger, looking at the list of the most trusting places, Putnam.
No, I mean, I know the Putnam argument, so I know where, and the Putnam argument.
The end costumes.
Well, I mean, I've never said that particularly, so that's weird. Okay, so number one, the Nazis were up the left. The Nazis were up the left, and I mean, if you read Hitler's books, if you read Mein Kampf, what you find is that he was very heavily influenced by Marx. Right? The split between the National Socialists and the Communists was a split over power, not over fundamental principle. And the fact is that the Communists were fascists. I mean, Stalin was a fascist. I mean, fascist was a system of government that suggested that a top-down elite ought to rule every aspect of life,